Hello, welcome back to The History Freak. Today I won't be talking about a particular individual, but I'll be talking about Tudor fashion. For me, it's so fun to think back to the Tudors and imagine them all in their amazing outfits. It seems they were certainly not afraid to spend a lot of money, and they even had very strict rules about clothing. Before we start, why not press that subscribe button? And therefore you won't miss out on any of our fabulous future content. Okay, let's check out some amazing Tudor fashion. Fashion was very important in Tudor life. At court and in portraits, image was used to communicate power, status, dominance, and wealth. When Henry VIII came to the throne, he was only the second king in the Tudor line. His father had sat on the throne for about 24 years, but his claim had been weak and he had won the crown in battle, and had to deal with multiple threats to his rule. Now we know, of course, that Henry VIII would rule for many years, but he didn't know that would happen. So it was very important for him to communicate from the start and throughout his reign the right message to his subjects. And one way he did this was through his clothing. The message being that he was a powerful king and he was here to stay. Henry used fashion very effectively. He was actually described as the best dressed sovereign in the world. This was because he liked to dress flamboyantly, using expensive fabrics, colours and jewels. The value of his wardrobe would be equivalent to millions in today's money. So, what did Henry like to wear? Well, he was much taller than the average man, being over 6 foot. So he had long, athletic legs, and he liked to show them off with short gowns. He also loved a hat, and had them made of expensive materials. He seems to have been a fan of beards and shorter hair, and he actually shaved his head at one point. His favourite colours seem to be gold and black. The codpiece, which would have been decorated and padded, is a great example of Henry using his clothing to communicate the message he wanted, which was that of masculinity and virility. This message would have become more important over his reign. As king, one of his most important jobs was to father sons to continue the Tudor line. Over the years, Henry constantly failed to get a healthy son, at least until his third marriage. It's possible at the time, with far less understanding of the science around having babies, that Henry may have felt his masculinity was in question, and therefore one of the ways to combat this was to have a large codpiece proudly on display. Whatever fashion example Henry set, the rest of the men at court would quickly follow. They would go to great lengths and expense to stay on trend and dress like the king. However, it was very important that they don't outshine him. For Tudor men, it was all about celebrating their masculinity and showing off their bodies. As Henry became more overweight, fashion changed, and a more fuller figure became fashionable with courtiers. They would wear padded clothes to look more like Henry. Henry VIII's first wife was Spanish, and she introduced to the English court the farthingale, which was a type of petticoat worn to give shape to a dress. As the English queen, she was expected to dress like an English woman. This was not a big problem for her, as Catherine loved the English people and was proud to be the queen. There were times, though, when she wore a Spanish headdress to make a political statement. Catherine is thought to have been a very well-dressed woman, and as her power started to slip, she used fashion to show her importance as queen over her rival, Anne Boleyn. There were detailed laws about how people from different levels in society should dress. The colour purple, for example, was just for royals. Even if people could afford luxuries like gold, you couldn't wear them unless you were from a higher class of society. It was really important that people stuck to these rules, as they could be fined if they didn't. When Henry's second daughter Elizabeth became queen, she, like her father, used fashion to show her power. In portraits, Elizabeth is communicated to the observer as wealthy, powerful, superior, virginal, and ageless. In Elizabeth's reign, the rules about fashion became even tougher, especially for women. Elizabeth dressed extravagantly, while women at her court, while still looking wealthy enough to be there, must look plainer than the Queen. It was important no woman looked better than her. The women would wear colourful gowns that went to the floor. As if the fine fabrics weren't enough to communicate their wealth, many ladies wore gloves to show they didn't have to work. Big ruffs became fashionable at Elizabeth's court for both women and men. Elizabeth liked black, white and silver. She wore lead on her face and bright-coloured wigs, as well as huge gowns and lots of jewellery. She would have worn a corset to look thin, which would have made movement tough. Fun fact, she may have been an amazingly dressed woman, but as a very young girl, Elizabeth's attendants complained she didn't have sufficient clothing for a girl of her status. After the end of her parents' marriage, times were less good for the young Elizabeth, as Henry focused on his next queen and getting a son. But in time, she would return to court and her father's favour, and have lovely expensive clothing once again. So what about Tudor children? How were they dressed? Well, young boys were dressed the same as young girls. As they got older, their fashion became more separate. Around the age 7 or 8, they would start to be dressed more like a man. Some are even said to have worn a dagger, which sounds kind of dangerous. Young girls might have had long hair, and it seems it was generally okay to wear their hair down, but once married, it was usually tied up tight and hidden away behind a headdress or a hood. Children, it seems, were often actually dressed just like younger versions of their parents. It wasn't like today, where there was way more fun, colourful fashion for children. It can't have been much fun for these energy-filled kids to have to wear such formal and restrictive clothing. But being a Tudor child wasn't all about having fun, and they were sometimes married off very young and expected to act very formally and more like an adult. Of course, a huge part of society were not fortunate to wear wonderful, expensive clothing, but had to make do with far less. Life for the peasants did slowly improve over time. It took years for change to happen, and these people had little choice but to wear clothes that were cheap, comfortable, and allowed them to work. Clothing was often made of wool, as it would keep them warm. The clothing would have to be made, as ready-made clothing would be expensive. Items would be passed down through the family so as to not waste anything. Colour would have been limited. As we saw before, there were rules on certain colours. Now, would they have been bothered by this? Well, although it doesn't sound very nice, it's hard to imagine a hard-working Tudor peasant really caring about the colour of his clothes. Well, that's it for this video on Tudor fashion. I really hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, why not check out the History Freak channel for more awesome history videos.